On behalf of the Learning Network and Knowledge Hub teams, welcome to today's webinar, Living with Coercive Control, Youth Perspectives. On behalf of our team, I acknowledge that our work is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehoik, and Chunuktung nations. These lands are connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. We make this acknowledgement to counter the doctrine of discovery and recognize Indigenous land and sovereignty. We also recognize that many Black people were violently displaced to Canada through settler colonialism and slavery. We will continue to work collaboratively with communities to challenge colonialism, anti-Black racism, and further forms of oppression that remain pervasive in Canada and that result in disproportionate impacts of gender-based violence on oppressed communities. Over the last 2 years or so, we have developed and distributed a number of resources on coercive control experiences by adults and youth in the context of intimate partner violence. In our most recent webinar, Emma Katz and Catherine Lawler presented research findings and interventions for children and youth experiencing coercive control and adult intimate partner violence. The missing piece was the opportunity to learn directly from youth advocates as they describe their experiences of coercive control and abuse, their subsequent experiences in the justice and service provision systems, and their insights. Today, 3 amazing young people are joining us to share their experiences and their wisdom. Please note that the experiences they will share are of historical coercive control and abuse that have been discussed and responded to. I'd like to introduce you to Lauren Irvin. Lauren is a youth advocate, and her many roles include her work with the Representative for Children and Youth of British Columbia and her ongoing work with the Youth Voices initiatives. She is sought after to partner with and present at many events, including the National Judicial Institute of Canada. Selena Lai is an advocate and works through Youth Voices initiatives. She hopes to educate legal professionals and help youth find their voices. Selena is with us today, and you will see her image on the screen, but she is unfortunately suffering from the loss of her voice due to illness. And at Selena's request, Lauren will share Selena's written reflections. Izzy Liebram. Izzy also is part of Youth Voices initiatives, and among many things, identifies as a songbird, a feminist, and an advocate for those who don't have a voice in the legal system. She is committed to helping build a better system for other youth who may be going through what she did. Dr. Peter Jaffe is not a youth. However, he is world-renowned for his research and work related to domestic violence, its impact on children, and the role of the criminal and family justice systems. And we're delighted to have Peter join our young panelists to set the stage for and to moderate today's discussions. Dr. Jaffe?
Thank you, Linda, for that introduction and reminding me that I'm no longer a youth, but I'm looking forward to hearing from these amazing young women. If we look at the next slide, it's an image that tries to capture the perspective of children. Unfortunately, what's often missing within the justice system and within our community more broadly is really hearing the voices of young people and what they have suffered by living with family violence and coercive control. Our objectives today that you'll see in the next slide are learning objectives. We hope to acknowledge some coercive control tactics and how they're used against youth and experienced by youth, to understand the direct impact of coercive control on youth, recognizing the importance of supporting youth rights and voices and decisions that affect their lives, and also learning how to better understand and support youth who experience coercive control. The next slide outlines some of the important context pieces that allows us to think about the importance of youth perspectives. And there are three issues that I'm going to touch on very briefly. The first is the UN rights of the child. The second is significant changes to Canadian family laws. And the third is the importance of us developing knowledge from youth's lived experience. The next slide gives you highlights of the UN rights of the child. And I'm repeatedly shocked when I do public presentations or even talk to professional groups, mental health professionals, judges, and lawyers who really have very little knowledge or understanding that Canada is a signature to the UN rights of the child. And we're not going to go through all those rights, but I want to highlight two of them. Article 12, the importance of a child's right to express their views freely in all matters affecting them, to their views being given due weight in accordance with their age and maturity, and the importance of children being provided the opportunity to be heard in any judicial proceeding affecting the child directly or indirectly or through a representative. And I can't tell you about the number of court hearings that I've been involved in where youth voices are absent, and even when requested, they don't receive the representation that they should have, and they don't have a voice in the proceedings. And Article 19, importantly, talks about a child's right to be free from all forms of violence. So these are really critical dimensions for the UN rights of the child. If you look at the next slide, important to acknowledge, and not everyone is aware of this, obviously those who work daily in the family courts are aware, but most Canadians aren't aware that there's been major amendments to family law across Canada. The Divorce Act, which is federal legislation dealing with a couple divorcing, and also provincial and territorial laws that deal with couples separating, now have factors related to family violence that need to be considered when judges are determining the best interest of children and potential future parenting plans. And I really want to emphasize this wording. This is one excerpt from the Divorce Act, Section 2. Family violence means any conduct, whether that conduct constitute a criminal offense, by a family member towards another family member that is violent or threatening, or that constitutes a pattern of coercive controlling behavior, or that causes other family members to fear for their own safety or for that of another person. And in the case of a child, the direct or indirect exposure to such conduct. I think it's really important to study those words. I've been involved in court proceedings across the country where a survivor of family violence is trying to raise these issues, and judges are expressing concern that one parent is saying bad things about another parent, when in fact it's part of the legislation. Or worse, when somebody indicates the children have been harmed, and that's not even considered. We still imagine that if somebody is a violent spouse, somehow they can still be a good parent, when in fact the legislation really makes us give this sober second thought and consider not only the direct impact of family violence, but also the indirect impact by exposure to this conduct. So I think that's critical, and it's overlooked all too often, in my view. The next slide talks about the reason why we have a webinar such as this one and many others, why we believe in the importance of learning about lived experience of youth. Why should youth be able to talk in court or talk at webinars such as this. And there's many reasons. Obviously, youth who've been through things such as coercive control and family violence know all the nuances of dealing with it and coping with it. And youth are not just passive victims. Youth are often coping in a variety of ways, which we need to understand much better. Professionals sometimes may hurt youth or silence them by offering our well-intentioned but misguided solutions, when in fact we need to be informed by youth about the solutions that may matter in their lives. And last but not least, professionals can't assess youth who've been through family violence or coercive control by putting their own experiences or the research and imposing that on youth. Youth are diverse in terms of their experiences. They're diverse in terms of their coping strategies. They're diverse in terms of the context of their lives and how they manage these issues. And it's important to hear directly from them. Now, as I say those words, I say to myself, well, this is common sense. Who would possibly be against hearing from youth? I can tell you I was recently at an international conference in another country, and we were talking about this very subject. And there was a 20-year-old young person who'd been in the courts for 8 years, but never had an opportunity to have either legal representation or be able to speak to a judge directly about what they had experienced in their family. So this young man talked about his experiences, and there was a number of rave reviews of the presentation after the presentation, but there's also a number of negative comments from mental health professionals who said, why did we let a young person speak? And weren't they going to be harmed by speaking publicly about this? And weren't we going to be making it worse? Or were we exploiting them by letting them speak about this? And I read those comments, and it was a reminder to me that not everybody understands the importance of youth sharing their lived experience. And in this situation, I think it's so critical that we give voice to youth. In the same way that conference was important for the young man to talk about the ways in which he'd been left out of any court proceeding and never had representation or a voice. So I want to emphasize that. And obviously for today's session, as Linda's already indicated, the issues these amazing young women will be talking about are all issues they already have been reported and talked with others about those experiences. And they're really important experiences for all of us to learn about. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn things over to our first presenter, Lauren, and just to let the participants and the audience members know, each of the young women is going to be talking about their personal experiences in terms of setting the stage for what they've been through. And then we'll be having a number of questions, which will probe in more detail about the meaning of these experiences and the lessons for all of us to learn. So I'll turn it over to Lauren to begin. Welcome, Lauren.
Thank you. So to tell my story in the justice system, my parents separated when I was very young, although the official divorce process took several years. My sister was between the ages of 3 and 5, and I was between the ages of 5 and 7 when all of this was going down. My father is an extremely successful man. He's a member of the Royal Society of Canada, and he's been the recipient of many awards. He's also written several books, and he's been flown all over the world to give talks and lectures. But underneath his shiny reputation, my father committed several inappropriate and harmful acts against our family. To give an example, he sent a letter to his divorce lawyer claiming that if my mother was given any custody time, there would be a child homicide case on their hands, claiming that my mother would be the perpetrator. However, even his own lawyers saw through this and realized that he was projecting his own violent thoughts. And it was his own lawyer that reported him to the BC Ministry for Child and Family Development, also known as the MCFD, who I will mention again later. And the MCFD deemed that there was a high enough threat of harm, but despite this clearly dangerous and foreshadowing behavior, his actions were ultimately dismissed by members of the legal system because of his impressive career and shiny reputation. So my father was ultimately granted custody of us 3 days of the week, while my mother was given 4 days. However, my mother did have final decision-making abilities. And under our father's care, my younger sister and I experienced frequent abuse, both emotional and physical, as well as neglect. Coercive control was also used as a tactical form of abuse, both during the period of my life when I lived with my father, and then even afterwards as well. And several complaints were issued to the Ministry of Child and Family Development. And eventually, an officer or social worker was sent to interview my sister and I. And the process was done very poorly. And the man was dressed in a black suit and he was wearing a briefcase and he was extremely intimidating and he acted stern and unfriendly and shot me down every time I tried to talk. And he wouldn't let me know why I was meeting with him or who he was. And every time I asked and pushed for some sort of understanding. And I remember the next night, I was so overwhelmed by fear what would come from this man's report, because at this time, I still had no clue who he was. In my childlike understanding of the world, he could have been an FBI agent in a black suit. And I was worried that he would anger my father, which would only result in an increase in the severity of the abuse that I was already receiving at home. And I actually worried that my life was at risk because of the lacking job performance by this officer. And because of this fear and this feeling of feeling left out and stuck in the unknown, which I know resonates with many youth, I actually considered taking my own life when I was 10 years old because I was so worried about the harm that this officer would inadvertently cause. But ultimately, nothing came from the man's report, and all future complaints that were issued were ignored by the ministry. And from this point going forward, my sister and I were left on our own. And a little time later, my father actually gave my sister a head injury, which is so severe that she now has lifelong whiplash disorder, chronic pain, brain damage, neurological issues, problems with her eyesight, and has been rendered hard of hearing, likely from the impact. And this all could have been avoided if the abuse had been picked up earlier by system professionals and if they'd listened to us when we tried to talk. So eventually, when I was 12 years old, I mustered up the courage and I left my father's house and I never went back. And as expected, he brought upon a storm of accusations of alienation against my mother. And he tried to force a reunification program. And he actually tried to take my mother to court 3 times in the span of 1 year. And although I actually never ended up in a courtroom, I almost did multiple times, as my father had a tendency to get cold feet and withdraw his legal motions about a day or two before we were scheduled to appear before a judge, only to restart those claims a month later and then begin the cycle all over again. And he had the money to bring one claim after another and string things out forever. And it was only once I was actually able to access a child lawyer to represent me when I was 14 years old that my father backed down. My sister did the same thing and she was 11 at the time. And this service was not court ordered. Instead, I actually had to reach out to the law firm myself and ask to be represented. And it was such a freeing feeling, almost therapeutic, to be honest, to be listened to and to have my voice respected for once. And having a child lawyer saved me. Many children don't know about this option, and it was a complete game changer for me. And I don't think I'd be talking to all of you here if I didn't get that legal representation. I think I would have been forced to see my father, and I think things would have gotten pretty bad from there. So as someone who's experienced both sides of the spectrum, both poor and quality child participation, I can say that there is a tremendous and very recognizable difference when children aren't kept informed about the legal proceedings that are currently underway. The ones that are very entangled in their lives and their well-being, it causes harm. So now I work to create change for children and youth in the system through my work as a youth researcher for provincial research projects on youth, and through my job at the Office of the Representative for Children and Youth BC, and also the Youth Voices Initiative. And I'm on the board of directors of the Hear the Child Society. And I also like to attend conferences and give guest lectures at university on the hope of educating professionals like yourself on how to include youth. So I'm happy to be here and talking a little bit about myself and my experiences today. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. We'll be back to you when you're Selena later on, and then answering questions. I'm going to turn things now over to Izzy to share a bit about her background and her experience. Welcome, Izzy.
Hi. What do you think of when you picture an abuser in your mind? what ethnicity, gender, personality, or even job describes an abuser. My abuser was my birth mother, who was a South Asian woman who worked for the federal government and was seemingly outgoing, nice, and amazing with kids. She was so good at covering up being an abuser that many of my friends, their parents, social workers, and teachers didn't believe me when I told them I was suffering abuse. I wish they saw what happened behind closed doors. This person sexually abused me for years while I witnessed her more verbal and emotional abuse targeted at my siblings. I watched her push my sister off her bike, step on our toes, calling it an accident, but above all else, used coercive control. I remember being terrified of her, but when asked why, I couldn't explain it to others. My abuser used the tactic of, I'm gonna kill you, or I'm gonna kill myself, or you will have no friends if you tell anyone about this. An example of her putting these threats into practice is when she made many of my friends and their parents believe I was being starved at my father's house, which was the furthest from the truth. So these well-meaning people would check my lunchbox at school, or my teacher would make strange comments to me around my classmates. To her and to my friends, she seemed like a concerned mother, but to me, it caused me to feel isolated and unsafe, even in the classroom. My friends would say, your mother would never do that, even running up to her and giving her hugs, while I was physically trying to get away from her. I walked into her house trembling with fear after the many times I talked to social workers. Though she would not always express her threats, her intimidation was intense enough. I was always walking on eggshells, fearing what this person could do to me. I walked on this tightrope for years, constantly reporting abuse but never being heard. Always doubted as the victim, as seeing them readily hand that title of victimhood to my abuser. I spent years in the court system, battling from ages 5 to 12. In the beginning, I had no idea that what I experienced was abuse because my abuser told me that all this was normal, that sexual stuff was playing a game, and that my siblings were just bad kids. My stepmom showed me what a good parent should be and that nobody should be treating me like my abuser did. Although my father was amazing, he was still living with intimidation and fear of my abuser after their separation. I decided I wanted to live with my father full time. One of the reasons I was not believed by police was because my sister Layla wanted to protect our abuser and herself. She was often severely rejected most by my abuser, and maybe she wanted to finally gain her love by covering up with her for the police. This is a key example of those prior threats affecting the child and the fear of what the abuser can do when disappointed or upset. My sister soon realized that nothing she could do could gain that love, and she wanted nothing to do with our abuser. We all fought not to have to live with her. Other factors that caused police and other professionals to ignore my pleas for help was the fact that I was very young. I had a bubbly personality, and I sometimes talked about hard things while laughing and smiling, since my abuser taught me that I was responsible for her emotions. I also needed speech therapy, but with so much chaos happening, I couldn't get the help I needed, and I still to this day talk younger than I am. I spent many weeks running from my bio mother, still required to see her after school, even though I lived with my father full time. I think a game changer in my case, though, was getting a lawyer. I after we got her in my case, I still had 2 years left of our court battle left, but I can gladly share with you all now that my court case is over, and I've been able to utilize the last 3 years of my life to heal from the abuse that I endured. My sister Layla endured the brunt of my abuser's coercive control, but I'm so glad to tell you all that she's been able to heal and talk about her own experience too. And I hope other children living through this hell can speak on their own behalf and find their own voices. Until then, I hope that my experience can be used for some good and that I can speak on behalf of my younger self and those still fighting for their voices to be heard. Thank you.
Thank you, Izzy, for sharing your story. I'm going to turn back to Lauren, who's going to share Selena's story. As those of you who joined in late, Selena lost her voice due to illness, but she wrote out her comments, and Lauren's going to share them on Selena's behalf.
All right, this is what she has written. 15 years ago, I experienced a legal system that said to leave children out of it. But when I did get caught in the crossfire, nobody did anything to help me. I had always wondered why it took a 10-year custody battle for the legal system to take action, when I had already made a decision to live with my mother. Today, I learned that what I experienced was coercive control. During my parents' divorce, my father accused me multiple times of being brainwashed and using legal authorities to silence me. Police, lawyers, counselors, and even school authorities, who I thought were there to protect me and trust to take action, didn't listen to me. It was difficult to ask for help when the abuse was almost invisible, when my choice, opinions, and emotions weren't validated by those who had a power to make a difference. I was told to exclude myself from the conflict happening between my parents, but I was there when the police came and forced me to go back to my abusive father's house when I had an asthma attack. I was there in the school office when my father pulled me out of class to berate me in front of my teachers. I was there when my classmate unknowingly delivered a threatening letter to me from my father. I was there when the counselor tried convincing me my father was a good person. I was there when my father's sister bruised 3 of my ribs and put me in the hospital. I was there when the police arrived only after I jumped out of my father's moving car and chased it down the street to rescue my brother during an attempted abduction. For 10 years, I was there, but no one listened to my cries for help. And despite all of this, my voice was not there. What my father did to my brother and I over the years was borderline criminal. But because we were just children, we weren't taken seriously. Whenever the police were called, they would send us back to our father's house because his lawyer would appear and recite the court order stating that it was his parenting time with us. Although there was mental and emotional abuse, the police didn't see this as a threat to us because he didn't physically hurt us. Instead, the police treated us like criminals, walking us back to our jail cell where my father would continue his abusive behavior of exploitation, isolation, and microregulation of our everyday life. I found it ironic that we were treated like children when it was convenient and forced to comply as we were considered too immature to know what was best for us, and we were forced to be more mature and withstand abuse like adults. When we were back in the house away from prying eyes, my father would always say that if we didn't obey him, he would keep us away from our mother, prevent us from seeing our friends, separate my brother and I at the next court hearing. My brother and I didn't expect to ask for much, so my father took away the only thing that mattered to us: freedom. Back then, I often heard the term, in the child's best interest, but I didn't really know what it meant. So I searched it up, and each factor that was taken into consideration included the resources of what each parent had to provide. Some factors included the mental well-being of a parent and the willingness of each parent to allow access to the child. For years, I thought, what about the well-being of the child? What about the child's willingness to stay with each parent? For someone like my father with sociopathic tendencies, narcissism, money, and legal knowledge, the legal system became a playground for my father to take advantage of, resulting in 10 years of me fighting a battle for my freedom. I never formed a relationship with my father. He often spent his time working, playing video games alone, or out with his friends, which is why I gave up on that relationship a long time ago. As a Chinese Canadian immigrant, my father preferred having a son to a daughter. Throughout my entire childhood, my father never bothered trying to start or repair that relationship unless it was through supervised access. Knowing that my mother and I had a strong bond, he would often threaten or harm her or alienate her from us if we didn't behave during these supervised sessions. In front of the supervisor, he was attentive, outgoing, and played the role of a pitiful father, trying his best to rekindle a relationship with his children, who was brainwashed by our mother. There were multiple occasions when people believed him and produced fake reports on his behalf to give him more access to us. Because my father's manipulation, I experienced unconscious bias, abuse, and coercive control, because many people in the legal system either choose to turn a blind eye, saw my situation through my father's tainted lens, or uneducated and unable to spot a coercive abuser. Today, I'm still angry, persistent, and will continue to share my story. I hope that one day all legal system actors can become educated on what a coercive control abuser is to prevent other children from experiencing what I did. Thank you for listening to Selena.
Thank you very much, Selena, for providing your perspective, and Lauren for sharing yours and reading for Selena and Izzy. And I think at this point, invite Izzy to come back on live and pursue a number of questions that certainly arise from your presentations. I guess the first question, we'll start with Lauren, is what things do you think you did or thought about that helped you navigate the justice system and engage with system professionals when you felt like you didn't have a voice? And you clearly talked about that with child protection intervention.
Well, in my family situation, my father levied several alienation cases against my mother. And I remember thinking it was the strangest thing ever. All these professionals were trying to suss out whether I didn't want to live with my father or whether my mom had manipulated me into not wanting to live with my father. And I kept wanting to intervene and include my voice to quickly interject and state that this was my decision and I wasn't being influenced by anyone. And it was my voice that everyone was trying to figure out and deduce. And yet I was never actually asked to speak up or share my thoughts. And so my mother and I both realized the downsides of not including me. So she personally paid for an independent voice of the child report to be done, where a specialist could deduce the true feelings and wants of my little sister and I. And that was done and submitted to the record. However, when I heard that the voice of the child specialist had sent his final report, I wasn't sent a copy as the child in question, and I didn't know what his ruling had been. So when I ended up accessing the Society for Children and Youth of BC, and I got myself legal representation for free, as I mentioned earlier, from there, I entered and became a third party in my parents' legal battle about alienation, custody, and forced reunification program, and which I did not want to participate in. And my lawyer now had access to the affidavits and documents that were being sent back and forth. And so I could see them and I could understand what was going on. And so my lawyer requested a copy of the Voice of the Child report's findings. And I think this was really phenomenal because we actually got to go over the document together with the professional who they did actually state that I was not being alienated and they did actually tell an accurate ruling of events. But I noticed small mistakes in the report, things like dates he got incorrect, or when I'd paraphrased an event that happened, he thought that those were literal and exact quotes I was pulling, and they were not. So my wonderful lawyer and I drafted up a letter and responded to this and gave my opinion on what had happened. And we sent this to be considered my parents' subsequent legal teams. So the ways that I went about being heard, and I truly believe that if I hadn't gotten a lawyer, my father would continue making cases against my mother, and without my voice, he would win. So I had to circumvent the norm and actively seek out ways that I could be legally represented because none were offered and none are offered for children. They have to search relentlessly and ask and beg anyone they can find. However, in regards to how I navigated issues of coercive control, well, it did appear while I was living with my father, he would control who I could see and also technology-based coercive control, such as trying to get me to stop contacting my mother when I was at his house or try to gain access to my private text conversations with my mother to surveil us. A lot of the controlling behaviors actually occurred after I left him, and I had to search for ways to legally stop this from happening. And to be honest, I often failed. For instance, he didn't want me to have access to a therapist or to be on any sort of medication. So when he saw that his insurance was covering a therapist appointment, he located the woman, he made an appointment with her, and he tried to force her to convince me that I should live with him again. I immediately switched therapists, but he found my next one and he sued her and tried to remove her counseling license for seeing me. And then I changed therapists again and he sued the next woman and tried to remove her license. And it became clear that I could no longer claim medical costs on his account because he would see that. And so I could no longer safely and privately access such services that as a trauma survivor I needed. And with controlling factors in the school, he would enter my high school and meet with my principal and teachers and request copies of my grades. And he would try to convince my teachers to talk to me about them. And I dealt with constant harassment in the form of text messages and emails and letters in the mail. And I tried to block his mails in the post, but it didn't work. I tried to block his email, but he would create other accounts. And there were 5 years where I couldn't even go on vacation because I couldn't update my passport without his authorization. So I felt like my privacy and my safety was under constant attack from his controlling behaviors. And for these non-court related issues, which arguably affect me much more on a day-to-day basis, they aren't actually covered by child lawyers, at least in BC, only like specific court cases are. So unfortunately, I haven't managed to find a way to have my voice heard in all regards. I haven't even gotten child support for the past 2 years, but I've never stopped trying and searching for these resources. I know that's the same thing with a lot of other youth.
Thank you, Lauren. Lizzie, the same question, the things that you think helped you navigate the system and engage with professionals when you felt you didn't really have a voice?
I also had a youth advocate from age 10 who would have private meetings with me and my two other siblings. And that was really amazing. Having somebody that had an unbiased, or seemingly to the judge, unbiased opinion. I also think that something that was very helpful was the judge handling my case had a private meeting with me, and he talked to me and asked me questions, and I felt very seen and heard. I also had a court appointed psychiatrist who was able to detect coercive control and the levels of abuse that other maybe lesser trained social workers and professionals could not see as clearly. And I also videotaped and recorded the horrific meetings I would have with my abuser and presented that through my lawyer to the judge. So I felt like all these things at the end of the day were able to build a stronger case against my abuser, and now I don't have to live with her. So that was all very helpful.
Lauren, Selena's perspectives on things that helped her better engage with the system when she didn't have a voice.
Yes. She says, I kept a journal to log the things that I experienced or even to gather my own evidence so that I could later recount the situation in detail. I did this to remind myself that what I experienced was real because a lot of people told me that I was mentally ill or I was being brainwashed by my mother. And it helped me reflect on my experiences and understand what was right and what was wrong and what I could and couldn't accept, and helped me figure out what I needed so that I could have that voice to people in the justice system.
Lauren, back to you as Lauren. What do you think service providers need to understand in order to better support children and their families? So obviously, we have hundreds people, I think 1,600 people at least registered for this session. So many service providers are wanting to learn from youth. What do you think they need to understand to better support youth?
Well, what I believe to be extremely important for family service providers to remember is that if domestic abuse or coercive control is being used against a child, then that child is probably being fed all sorts of threats and manipulative lies about the justice system in order to keep them trapped in their current predicament. So children might need you to extend your hand a little bit more than adults would, because children wouldn't even know that there's a helping hand there for them at all. To give an example of the kind of lies that the justice system that a parent can use to control their children, one night, my sister, who was about 7 years old at the time, used physical violence against my father in an act of self-defense to protect herself and to get away from safety. And of course, no real or serious damage was inflicted, as my sister was a weak, skinny 7-year-old and my father was a muscular grown man. And yet for years, my father hung this incident of self-defense over her head and said that the second she reached the age of 13, she could be convicted and sent to a prison for what she had done. And there was this constant threat that if she ever left his custody, he would go to the authorities and have her sent to prison. So she remained a victim of his abuse for years because in our manipulated childlike understanding, the alternative was a juvenile detention center. And even after she finally left his custody, that threat haunted her for years until she learned more about the system and her rights and discovered that everything she believed was part of a lie. So of course, there's no logic behind what my father was saying. He could never have her sent to prison for what she did, but a 7-year-old doesn't know that. And here's where an important factor, I think, in the power imbalance between adults and children is felt most strongly in the legal system. Adults, parents in this case, have at least a functioning and rudimentary understanding of what their rights are and what they're able to do within the system. And even if they don't, they have the resources usually to meet with lawyers and learn more and protect their rights. And children aren't entitled to this sort of education. And I didn't know what my rights were as a child. And I find that I'm still learning new things each day because lawyers and service providers often don't see it fit that children should be informed about such things. There's this overwhelmingly popular practice to protect the child, but what's really being done is young people are being ignored, sidelined, and intentionally kept uninformed on matters. And it's this thought that it's too traumatizing to inform children about their rights or their abilities or the services they can access in the system. And I'll tell you for certain, it's not traumatizing like it's made out to be. And what is traumatizing is remaining in a household that's circulating coercive control or domestic violence and being unable to leave because children aren't told how to do that safely and what resources they can access. And when there's no external information being offered these children, a parent practicing coercive control can litter children's minds with all sorts of lies about their rights and the way that the legal system works in order to keep them scared and ensure that they don't reach out for help. And this manipulation can be so intricate that children can refuse help and lie to social workers about their home life because they have a false understanding about what happened to them if they told the truth. So to the professionals watching, I would urge them to be honest with the young people they work with and help ensure that the child knows what their rights are and why they're seeing you and why they're talking to you in that instant and what you want to get out of meeting with them. And lastly, what kind of actions you can undertake to support that child if they ever come to need it. Don't wait for the child to disclose abuse before you tell them what you could actually do in a situation where that would happen, or maybe explain what abuse or coercive control even looks like. Sometimes children need evidence and an explanation of what supports are at the ready for them if something were to happen or was already happening. So I would say reach your hand out first, and that child might never find themselves in the position where they need to take it, but at least they always know it's there.
Thanks, Lauren. Lizzie, same question for you. What do you think service providers listening in today need to understand in order to better support children and youth?
I think they need to understand that not all children know that what they face is abuse. That if they think, like I have said in interviews when I was very young, oh, my mom's not abusive, that's because the only mom I knew for a very long time was somebody who was abusing me and my siblings. And I also think that they need to understand that not all children talk about abuse the same. Some talk about it like I did, laughing and smiling because of fear of disappointing their abuser, while others might look scared and terrified, as maybe you would see depicted in movies. So I think to see different children as different people, that we're not all the same. So we don't talk about abuse the same.
And Lauren, Selena's perspective on this question?
Yes. Selena says, there needs to be a better way for service providers to have some basic form of training to identify narcissists when there is coercive control or abuse. For starters, understand that not everyone is what they seem to be. And if there's a large discrepancy between the report, the way the adult behaves, and how the child acts, listen to the child. It's also important to bring a child's view into a high conflict divorce, either through a report, assigning a lawyer to the child, or simply interviewing the child to understand their perspective. A decision any service provider makes could have a lasting impact on the child. So it's important to carefully make your decision after considering all the factors and to be aware of any unconscious bias.
Lauren, what do you think the key messages are for children and youth who might be watching today, or if you were talking to a group of youth, what are the key messages for them going through the justice system?
Well, to kids or their parents going through the justice system, I would say when their parents, who are their protective parents, are trying to do their best for kids and trying to ensure their children's wishes are heard, my advice, of course, depending on the child's willingness, is for a child to always have a third party to represent them. And this doesn't have to be a lawyer. This can be a child advocate, or it can be done through the Voice of the Child report. And the reason I'm emphasizing this is because a lot of parents have their children talk to their own divorce lawyer or try to find a way to funnel the child's voice out of one of the parents' mediums or to tell their children's experience themselves as a parent. And while this is done with the best intentions, it's really important that the person representing and elevating a child's voice is a third party who's solely linked to that child and there to support that child. Because when it becomes to someone who's also representing or intertwined with the parent, it becomes messy. When parents try to echo their children's thoughts and wishes, it's like a game of telephone. For example, my mom was dealing with an alienation suit for an entire summer before she told me about it. And she'd been trying to brave my father on her own and prove that he'd abuse us, but without actually talking us or engaging us about it. So inevitably, she would write down and experience the abuse that we'd suffered. But because she herself didn't live through it, she was putting the wrong date down, or she was saying someone was there when someone wasn't actually there in that event, or we were in a location that we weren't actually in. And she couldn't talk to us about it and ask us questions because we weren't supposed to know about the legal suit happening. Or if she did, she had to do so discreetly. And it was enough for my father to call her out on it. And it was only once my sister and I secured our legal representation that we could explain and recount our details and experiences without any issues. So ensuring that a child's voice is told separately from their parents, even if both the parent and the child are on the same page and echoing the same thing, is my top advice for children and families going through the justice system.
Lord, just if I could follow up, I think one of the interesting parts of your answer is the allegation of alienation, because in some ways that would silence your mother from being able to share things with you, because that would prove alienation, that may perhaps you're turning you against your father, so to speak. So was that something that you had to address directly, or is it just by persevering the way you did?
Yes, it was very difficult thinking about the image that was always being perceived. We were always thinking about how things were going to look. Of course, there was this whole idea, especially when there's abuse going on, that if one parent is abusing the child, the other parent can't say, oh, that's a bad thing, you're abusing this child, because then they'd be saying something negative about the other parent. And it was really difficult trying to move through the justice system, my mom and I on the same page, but we can't seem like we're too close, because then that looks bad in terms of alienation. And so it felt like our image was also something we had to be hyper aware of as well.
Thanks for that. Is it your perspective on key messages for youth and their parents going through the justice system?
I think for youth, I would want to tell them not to be discouraged, but to be hopeful. I remember thinking that maybe the only way I could get away from my abuser would be to die, and that's a very dark thought. And I'm glad that I've been able to heal since then and also get away from my abuser. But I think that I want kids to know that it will end one day, and with different people like as youth advocates and different things like that, you can be free from your abuser, and there are hopeful ways to do that. And I also think I want to tell youth and even parents to embark on a healing journey, and just because you need to be free from the demons and the abuser that and the inner critic living in your mind too, not just the one in the physical.
And Lauren, do you want to share Selena's perspective on this question about key messages?
Yes, she has two parts. So first, to the parents in a high conflict divorce, her message is that your children are autonomous from you. They have their own thoughts and feelings. Even if you do not want to form a relationship with them, at the end of the day, it's their decision, and forcing them to be with you when they don't want to is going to make life hard for them. So if you let them go, they'll reach out to you when they're ready. And if you want the best interest of the child, do whatever it makes to make them happy, not what makes you happy. And to all the children going through a high conflict divorce, her message is to never give up, to keep voicing your thoughts and emotions. Don't believe anyone that invalidates your thoughts and emotions. Someone will listen eventually. You're more powerful than you think. You just need one person who will listen and advocate for you amongst a sea of those who don't. Lastly, the legal system is changing, slowly but surely, and we all have a responsibility to fix it for the next generation of children.
Great. Thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Selena. And Izzy, going to turn things back to Linda to chair this part of the session, which is dealing with some of the great questions coming in.
That's right, Peter. There have been so many questions. So you've touched some nerves, and people are really resonating with your messages. So Jasmine Tabibi, my colleague, and I are going to take turns presenting questions. Sometimes we'll ask one of you to start, but that doesn't mean if somebody else would like to join in, please just let us know. And sometimes we'll ask all of you to respond. The first question relates a little bit to something you've already touched on, but is a little bit more specific. When and how did you as children begin to identify that what you were living was not normal or typical or healthy? And how long did it take to understand that you were experiencing coercive control or abuse? I wondered if maybe you would start us off with that one, Lauren.
Sure. Wow, that's a really interesting question. It's making me think. I think a lot of it's gradual. I don't think you wake up one day as a child and you're like, wow, I'm dealing with this. I think I was probably, I think I came in waves too. I think sometimes because it was my normal, and I think Izzy addressed this earlier, it was my normal for a parent to act that way, for a parent to say those things to me, for a parent to do those things. And I think I realized it was wrong, but because it was so normalized, it didn't really affect me too much. And honestly, it's only been in recent years, I feel like, even sometimes when I'm giving a talk, and I'll think for a second, that's probably not normal that happened, and it sinks in. So I think it's something that slowly I've had to come to terms with and realize this doesn't happen for everyone, especially because my inner circle is also of youth who go through all these experiences. But I think I was probably around the ages of 9 or 10 when I started to realize things were off and I probably needed to try to get out of there.
Thanks, Lauren. I'm wondering, Izzy, can you share a little bit about how that realization, Lauren used the words, things were off, something's not quite right here. What kinds of things contribute to that understanding for a young person?
Well, I think being in the public school system, different friends and such, we're talking about in more joking terms, abuse and stuff like that, and like different things like that. So I realized, hey, that though they're joking, that kind of sounds like something happening in my real life. So when she's talking about, oh, this character hit somebody else and they were joking that it was abuse, I'm like, hey, my birth mother pushing somebody off their bike or stepping on our toes with her shoes on when we come back after the police force us back, something's not seeming right. And also, I think my father was definitely very fearful that it was gonna really hurt us if we knew that what my mother was doing was abusive. But I think my stepmother led the way in just showing, even if they weren't talking about it, showing what a good mother would be. So with sexual abuse, saying, hey, don't do that, I was like, hey, why is my abuser making me do that? Or with threats and stuff like that, hey, parents don't threaten children and they don't tell them that they're going to kill themselves if they tell the police what's happening and things like that. So it was definitely gradual. It didn't just happen one day. Like Logan said, you don't wake up and then you're like, oh, I see. It kind of happens slowly. So yeah.
Yeah. And Selena, I'm just wondering, Lauren, did Selena want to add anything to that discussion?
I'm not sure. I haven't received a message, but
Okay.
perhaps maybe she can, maybe if she's interested, write some replies as we go on and we can read them out later.
I just want to turn, before I turn it over to Jasmine, I just want to ask Peter for your input. Hearing Lauren and Izzy's comments, what does it mean for service providers? Given a child, it's a gradual process. The family is all that they know. They don't necessarily have a comparison in terms of what's happening in other families or other homes. What can service providers do, Peter, in working with children?
I was hoping you're going to add prevention to your question, but so let me answer that part of the question you didn't ask. So I think we'd want to have universal prevention programs. Every school system in the curriculum, starting in junior kindergarten to the end of high school, needs to have information about healthy relationships. It's got to be built into the curriculum. So every student learns about every form of abuse, not just physical and sexual abuse, but also coercive control, emotional abuse. So I think that's critical, obviously age appropriate. For service providers, I think it's important to define issues. I think in interviewing young people, we can no longer ask people directly, are you abused? Yes or no. Have you witnessed family violence? Yes or no. I think we have to define issues. We have to define the terms that we mean. For example, not asking somebody, were you abused, but asking, were there times when there are things happening in your family that frighten you, make you feel uncomfortable, make you want to leave, make you want to go for help. So I think, just in brief, it's really asking questions in the right way and probing. So you're including some definitions and feelings as you're talking to young people about what they're experiencing, and not assuming that everybody walks around with definitions of coercive control in their head, which they don't.
If I might jump in here, I just got a response from Selena.
Good.
She says that from a very young age, since there was physical abuse involved, after speaking to my classmate in elementary school, I realized that it wasn't normal to have that level of restricted freedom and to be monitored or controlled as much as a child. Despite the abuse, my father always appeared happy-go-lucky to the public, where I felt negative emotions. So that disconnect made me realize that something wasn't right. And I think a lot of this echoes what all three of us have been saying around schools and having that outside connection with like friends that made us realize that our home life wasn't echoing what the public life was.
And again, a message to school communities to make sure people are included and involved and not left out because of that important connection. Jasmine?
Yes, thank you, Linda. The next question is, some would argue that children of a certain age are too young to contribute meaningfully to decisions being made about them. Is there a certain age when children should be given a choice, in your opinion? And I invite you all to share your answers, but perhaps I could ask you, Izzy, to start us off.
I don't really think there should be a set age. I know recently I listened to a talk by this woman named, I think, Linda Lundy. I'm so sorry if I got her name wrong. And she was speaking on behalf of children, saying that every child needs to be taken into consideration separately. And I very much resonate with that. I think maybe at 5, I didn't quite have my thoughts together on who I wanted to live with, what was abuse. But by 9, 10, I definitely did. And I definitely knew who I want to live with. But for other children, it might be totally different. Maybe by 5, they already know what abuse is and they know stuff maybe by 12. So I think it just needs to be taken case by case and not just be like, oh, when you're 12, you get to make decisions.
Yeah, continuing off of that, I think that a child's level of involvement obviously differs based on their age and their mental capacity. But I think that every child, even when you're really, really young, if we're talking like a 4 or 5-year-old, they might not be able to say, hey, I like it here, I like it there, I like when this happens, but they know where they feel safe. They know what adult they feel safe around. Maybe they can't actually speak it to the way that an older teen can, but you can find other ways, having child therapists, using play therapy, talking, using other ways to talk to children at a young age and figure out, oh, they feel safe here, they don't feel safe here. Oh, at this house, they're constantly crying and throwing tantrums and wetting the bed and they come back with rashes. At this house, they sleep throughout the night and they're happy and they're not crying as much. And you can kind of tell where a child's safe and where it isn't. And so I don't think there's a specific age that you should limit, because I think also every child's different. There could be one 10-year-old who isn't mature enough to speak their voice and doesn't really want to go into and have a child lawyer. There could be another 10-year-old who's ready to get in there and wants to speak and spread their voice. So I think also on a case-by-case basis, because no child is identical and they're going to mature at different rates.
Thank you, Lauren. And has Selena responded with an answer?
Yes, she has. She said, I think regardless of age, it depends on the child's maturity and the willingness as to whether they want to speak or not. I think it's actually dangerous to place needless restrictions, and that regardless of whether that child is able to clearly articulate, the judge or lawyer should still put a face to whose life they're impacting, because their decision creates a large impact.
Thank you, Selena. Peter, did you have any thoughts that you'd like to share?
I always have a thought, even though Lauren took most of my answer, which I needed a PhD for in many years of training. I will say I'm jealous, but having said that, the one thing I'd say is that young people can get a lawyer at birth. So there are children. So if there's a court proceeding and a judge feels that parents are polarized and the child's perspective is lost, even an infant, a judge can, in most jurisdictions, most provinces, and states, I know, can appoint a lawyer to represent the child's interests, which might be fairly unique. And in terms of the age at which children can speak directly to lawyers or come to the court is really Lauren's answer. There are kids who are 5 going on 15, and there's kids who are 15 who may not want to be part of proceedings for different reasons. So it can age and maturity is a big factor. But I think just the other point I want to say, it's so what Lauren said an hour ago about talking to a lawyer can be therapeutic is so critical, because we often think children will be harmed by speaking to a lawyer or having a voice, when in fact it is so important that they are heard, because they'll remember that for years that they did have a voice in the proceedings.
Thank you, Peter.
When Peter opened, he talked about an experience where there were mixed reactions in the audience about even having young people share their stories and share their insights into what might have been more helpful. And I'm just wondering, based on all of your experiences, you've made persuasive and compelling arguments for children and youth being listened to them, people recognizing they have a voice. Just wondering, what are some of your thoughts at this point into why does that seem to be so difficult for some well-intended helpers in the system and professionals to recognize the importance of children having a voice? Any thoughts on that? I see you're ready to weigh in, Lauren.
I guess I'll go first. I think a lot of it doesn't come from like malice or wanting to purposely silence the child. I think a lot of it comes from routine and what is being trained and what people are used to. I think a lot of lawyers or judges maybe aren't used to working with children. I think it differs by province, but in BC, we don't have specialized court systems. You could have someone hearing criminal court cases all day or, environmental law, and then they switch to child law in the afternoon and they don't know anything about it. So I think it's raining really loud right here, so I'm not sure if you can hear that in the background. But I think that because some people don't know how to interact with children, they're not used to it. They're so afraid that they're going to do harm that they try to do as little as possible, and that actually creates harm. So it's from a good intention, I think, often of, oh, I'm going to mess this up if I try to talk to this child, if I try to do something, and because of that worry that they're going to do something wrong, they do nothing. And I think that's what I see quite often is happening.
Izzy?
For me, it can be a bit of a confusing thing. I try to constantly surround myself with small children and try and have even playful times, but also asking them about silly things like Santa Claus and asking about the tooth fairy. And asking what all these different things about them. I feel like the conversation can be difficult sometimes to have with a child because they're just different developmentally. They're not 20-year-olds, they're little kids. They're like 5. But I do think that surrounding yourself with kids and knowing how kids talk, how they talk about feelings is a good way to constantly know kids, not just know kids when you were also a kid. I don't fully understand the thought of harming kids when you speak to them and try and add them to the case. So I don't know fully how to weigh in on that.
I think you did weigh in on it. And does Selena have additional words of wisdom?
Yes. She says, I think it's due to discomfort. A lot of legal system actors may feel uncomfortable because they don't know how to talk to children or they're worried they may traumatize the child. But I will say that a lot of children in high conflict divorce have been through much worse and just want someone to talk to who will listen to them rather than console them. I guarantee that it's going to be very hard to traumatize the child even more after what they've been through. Just simply listening is what any child needs, and to show you that they care and want to help, even if you're unsure what to do, because you're empowering that child by validating your experiences.
Profound words. I'm just wondering, Peter, there's a number of questions about training and what do we need to be doing. As you listen to the responses coming from Lauren and Izzy and Selena, thoughts about what this may mean in terms of ongoing training and education?
For sure. I think I agree with all the comments about sometimes adults and professionals discomfort in talking to children. They may not have the basic skills or understanding. And a good news story, Lauren and I were part of a conference in Quebec City with the National Judicial Institute, and we actually had two outstanding judges, one in Ontario, one in Quebec, that actually did role plays. They actually role played interviewing a child, and they had a video in one instance and how to properly do that. So, and I think that's the key. So obviously more judicial education and legal education. I mean, it's no different than being a social worker and a psychologist or any professional. You might specialize in children or you don't, but you interview children and you have to develop sort of that skill and that comfort to do that. So I think that's critical. I think the other thing I'll just say that if you spend all day with adults, if you're in the justice system and all you see is other lawyers and judges and court clerks and parents milling about disputes, children are neither seen nor heard. And it's like people say to themselves, do we really need kids here? It's such they don't belong in the courthouse. So it's getting people past that to actually see the children's role actually being helpful and informative and important, because we are talking about youth's future, and they should be at the table.
Thank you.
The next question is, given that many of your experiences took place while you were of school age, do any of you think that a lesson or an awareness poster, an assembly in a school might have been of use in presenting your rights to you and avenues that you could have taken? And perhaps I'll start with you, Lauren.
It's a very quick answer. 100%. Absolutely, yes. I think it's really, really important to have things like in schools, especially for young children, because they probably don't know what abuse is or what coercive control is, what's right, what's wrong, who to reach out to. So I think having maybe a session in a school to talk about that, or having posters, or having maybe guidance counselors educated and trained on that is really important.
Thank you. And Izzy?
Yes, I love the idea of like having ways that children can figure out what abuse is, how they can go forward in getting away from the abuser or dealing with abuse. But I know that's something, my father is a teacher, and I loved when he told me that he taught a lesson at his school. I think he was teaching kids that were 8, and he was teaching them about abuse and these different things in a lesson. It was a very short lesson, but he already could detect many of them were being abused at home. So I was very glad that there were already things happening that even I didn't have when I was that young. That was amazing.
Thank you, Izzy. And Lauren, does Selena have a response she'd like to share?
Yes, she says, yes, the more resources, the better. And if possible, resources for teachers and counselors as to how they can better support us too.
Thank you.
Another question that has come in, you've framed a lot of your responses around involvement in the justice system. And one of our participants is wondering, what do all 4 of you suggest when there's a youth who's experiencing coercive control, but they're not involved in the youth justice system, or sorry, I didn't mean youth justice system, but in the justice system. So there's not a family court case, there's not a criminal case going on. What would be your suggestions in terms of a person who finds themselves in that situation? And I'm wondering, Peter, if maybe you want to start us off first of all, and then I'm going to come back to Selena, Izzy, and Lauren.
When we talk about a person finding themselves, are we talking about a friend or family member or community?
I'm talking about a child or youth who is experiencing coercive control. It may be in the form of intimate partner violence within their home, maybe in terms of more parent-child abuse and coercive control occurring there or after separation. But just wondering if that person isn't connected to a specific helping system or service and not connected with the court system in any way, what can we as individuals on this panel offer to that person or suggest to that person?
Well, it all depends. To me, an important starting point is educating the whole community. I mean, it takes a whole village to prevent child abuse and protect children from coercive control and family violence. So part of it is broad public education and understanding the things that harm children. So obviously the first line of defense are going to be peers at school who are hopefully informed. They're going to be extended family members, hopefully, who may advocate for child safety or get involved with some difficult conversations, as appropriate. So I do think public education and the role of friends and family to support young people in these circumstances and encourage them to speak out and advocate for their safety and protection.
So Peter, you're saying the more as citizens, the more as neighbors, friends, and families, we understand these issues, then the more likely, if a child does share that they're experiencing something like this, the more likely we are to be able to respond in a way that's supportive and helpful, whether that's connecting them to a resource, a service, etc.
Yeah, and I'll be very concrete. I think when most people hear the term family violence, they're thinking about physical abuse or sexual abuse. Very few people think about emotional and psychological abuse. So I know we've gone through now a whole generation of seeing pictures of people with bruises and telling them to call 911 or go to the local shelter. I think we have to start promoting public education campaigns, public service announcements that deal explicitly with emotional and psychological abuse and living in fear and intimidation. So people identify that as a problem that requires intervention, requires support within the extended family or friendships, but then obviously support from social services, mental health, or the justice system.
And from our youth on the panel, I'm going to ask if Lauren, either as yourself or representing Selena, would you like to start us off?
Well, I haven't heard anything back from Selena yet, but maybe she'll type something while I'm talking. Everything that Peter said around trying to have it in schools and trying to make kind of public awareness around what coercive control is or non-physical violent forms of abuse. Because I do agree, like the first thing that comes to my mind is when I think of abuse is physically or sexually being hurt. And that didn't happen too much to me. It happened to my sister, but not to me. So I was a hard time actually coming to terms that I was abused and I was experiencing abuse because I was never hit or anything. So I think having something in schools and making it publicly aware, I think this might be a bit of a biased answer for me because I work for them now, but I know you can contact the representative for children, youth in any province. That's what my family did, actually. That's how we found out about child lawyers. We contacted them and we said, hey, what resources are available to us? They said, you can get a voice to child report, you can get a child lawyer, and they gave us all of our options. So that's always a resource for kids to contact. And I'll pass it over to, I got a response from Selena right now. She says, I think the most dangerous thing one can experience in that situation is losing their sense of self because there's so much control and manipulation that's entirely possible for a child to lose their identity and to feel trapped, which could lead to more problems later on. To protect yourself in that situation, I think it's important to surround yourself with people who will listen to you, believe you, and remind you that you are different and not what your parents say you are, and to trust yourself. The little voice in your head, whether it comes from anxiety and nervousness, is real and it's an instinct. And if you ignore it or gaslight yourself from that feeling and invalidate it, you could possibly lose that little voice forever. So it's important to build that system of support and connect with others who've maybe been through a similar experience and share that hardship. For example, our Youth Voices initiative. She's doing a self-promo, as was I earlier.
And all three of you are actively involved in Youth Voices initiatives. And again, we don't know, but maybe that's something we could explore, or maybe are there similar, is that a national Youth Voices initiatives? Is that across the country?
We're
And
only based in BC at the moment, but I think there probably are similar things in each of the provinces, or I hope so, and there's starting to be things like that.
so that's maybe something we can explore and then share with everybody that participated in today's webinar. Izzy, did you want to add something to this part of the discussion?
I definitely think that people knowing what mental abuse is very important. And then also getting the help they need with companies like, I think it's Society of Children and Youth BC is where I got my lawyer so she could talk to me, but my parents and maybe other people couldn't. She could be like, oh yeah, this is abuse. This is how we walk through getting this abuse dealt with and stuff like that. So I think that's important.
So I'm really hearing, don't lose yourself, connect with people who are supportive, believe in you, reach out to those people, and to don't give up. Keep looking until someone connects you if you can't find those resources, through a crisis line, through other services that are out there. Okay, thank you. Jasmine, another question?
Sure. So the next question is, based on your experiences and your knowledge, how could one recognize abuse from extended family, relatives, and or parents, friends, or any other non-parental coercive control? Maybe I'll start off with you, Lauren.
Sure. How to recognize abuse. I think Peter could probably pull up the textbook for you, but I think when you're not thinking about physical or sexual forms, if you're thinking about coercive control, I think you just have to kind of look inside yourself and think, oh, am I comfortable around this person? Do I have agency around this person? And I mean, I noticed the ways that I thought around my mom and the ways that I thought around my dad were polar opposites. And I didn't really even notice them. For example, if I had to go meet my dad somewhere, I was there 20 minutes early. I was already at everything I needed. I was like freaking out if I was going to be late or miss a bus, or I had to make sure my room was super tidy. I would wake up at 6 in the morning. I'd do all my chores because I was so worried about what would happen if I didn't. And just having that, like, oh, I have to text this person right at this moment or else they're going to freak out. And just always being on high nerves around someone versus when you can kind of look inside yourself and think about how you feel when you're with the other parent or with another family member and realize, oh, I'm kind of calm. Oh, I missed my bus. I'll text them and say, oh, sorry, I'm late. Oh, I slept in 15 minutes. Oh, that sucks, but it's not the end of the world. And just trying to figure out where you have a sense of freedom and where you don't. And sometimes it's hard for you to recognize yourself. Sometimes an outside person has to say, hey, you kind of act really different when you're around so-and-so. And for instance, when we were ever at like family, like parent nights, or when we were like at, when I did dance competitions as a kid, I would always be next to my father, clinging to him. I would ignore my mother because I was like so worried and wanted everything to be perfect. So even though I like would do all the chores that my dad's, I'd behave my best behavior. Sometimes being too much of a perfect child around someone is a bit of a tell.
Helpful. Thank you, Lauren. Izzy, did you have any thoughts?
I think I agree with knowing how you feel. I know that before I was around my abuser, I would get anxious, very much like Morgan, feel sick to my stomach, feel like just so almost like I was having a panic attack, just like terrified, and then still being very stiff and scared while meeting with this person. So I think checking your emotions and feelings when you are around somebody after you're around them. Do you feel bad about yourself after you hang out with somebody? Do you feel doubtful of yourself and your mental health? Things like that I think are really helpful, doing a self-check.
Thank you, Izzy.
Yeah, I think just to add in one more thing myself, I think nothing's ever or very rarely going to be a black and white situation when it's a family member that you're close to. So it doesn't mean you have to be, oh, I'm 100% always uncomfortable and never want to hang out with that person. You can still be, oh, I'm looking forward to board game night with that person tonight, even though I'm a bit nervous and I feel awkward and uncomfortable around them. It doesn't have to be 100% of the time you always feel terrible, because oftentimes it's a confusing relationship when they're a family member and there's still some sort of positive feelings mixed in with the negative ones. So, and Also, Selena just messaged me and she says, I think it's important to suss out authenticity. Someone who genuinely cares about you will not have a biased view or convince you to do anything you don't want to do. If you can feel that you're being yourself and feel calm, then you're in a safe space. When you're constantly walking on eggshells and are thinking about how you should act around a certain individual, then that person doesn't make you feel safe. The interaction should feel effortless and authentic.
Thank you. Thank you, Selena.
Jasmine, could I just jump in because Lauren mentioned the textbook answer. The textbook answer is very much part of what Lauren and Izzy just shared, because part of it is knowing how you feel. I mean, feeling fear or losing your sense of agency, I think, as Lauren said. But it's also important to think about what the behaviors involve. So, for example, although the law has changed, we now talk about coercive control in law, people still have trouble understanding what it actually means. And the key part of the meaning is it's really refers to a pattern of behavior over time, which really is part of trying to control and dominate another individual. So it can involve use of intimidation, use of threats, emotional abuse, isolating somebody, denying or minimizing what's actually happening, using economic abuse and control. So the key thing is looking for pattern of behavior over time that's really all about taking away somebody's freedom or sense of agency and engendering fear.
I am afraid that we are running out of time. And so at this point, I would, on behalf of the Learning Network and Knowledge Hub team, Jasmine and I want to thank all of you for being with us today. It's just been, for me personally, inspiring to see the courage and confidence with which Lauren, Izzy, and Selena shared their stories, but also their suggestions and insights and lessons learned in terms of trying to help the rest of us do a better job to be there for children and to recognize their voice. And it's always great to have you, Dr. Jaffe. Peter, we are so glad that you joined us, that you helped us plan and coordinate this, and to add your support to us and everybody that's doing this work out there. So with that, we also want to express our appreciation to Jessica and Dean for the ASL interpretation. Always so grateful when you spend the time with us and for the wonderful service that you provide for these webinars. Also want to thank Caroline and Sylvie for providing the French interpretation and for making what we do more accessible to a broader audience. So with that, we were pleased to see that well over 700 people joined us for most of this webinar. And we know that there's others who registered who want to access the recording that weren't able to be with us. And we look forward to future webinars and to hearing from Lauren and Izzy and Selena and Dr. Peter Jaffe in the future. Bye for now.